Now I would like to invite our next speaker, Professor Susan Mcintyre-Tamwoy, who is the Associate Director, Extant Heritage Limited. She is and has been for the major part of her professional and academic career a cultural heritage consultant. She is the president of ICOMOS, if I pronounce this correctly, ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites. And she is, from her background, an archaeologist and an anthropologist. She has been engaged in heritage planning, in historical site conservation, asset management, and cultural heritage research. Right now, currently, she is the principal investigator in an Australian Research Council linkage project with the aims of documenting the cultural value of a cave in the Nakanal region of East New Britain in Papua New Guinea, and I think you will also mention this in your talk. And the talk will focus on Transborder intangible cultural heritage and the challenges for implementation of the convention. Please, Susan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Helga. And just for any other ICOMOS people here, I'm not the president of ICOMOS, just of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Committee, so not that quite as grand. Okay, so I don't know how many people know a lot about the UNESCO Convention for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage, so I might be telling a few of you things you already know, but just so that everyone is on the same page. This convention was conceived as a harmonizing tool that could, in part, work to mitigate the negative impacts of globalisation, while at the same time creating opportunities for renewed dialogue amongst communities within and across national borders, and thereby help maintain the world's cultural diversity. However, it's state parties that do the nominating of the elements that are proposed for international listing, and the Intergovernmental Committee is largely comprised of, politicians, bureaucrats. Given that the convention is driven by nation states, it's probably inevitable that politics and politically driven perceptions will affect and to some extent distort the interpretation and implementation of the convention's original objectives. And so this gives rise to a whole range of questions around this, what is quite a noble endeavour. So in this presentation, I'll explore some of the complexities that I've observed relating to the identification and consideration of intangible cultural heritage. I'll probably fall into the trap of saying ICH just because it's shorter, so intangible cultural heritage in countries with high internal ethnic diversity, and some of which groups then go off to contribute to this worldwide diasporic communities. Cultural diaspora, of course, is not a new phenomenon, and we heard this morning about the Chinese diaspora. And one could argue that it's only going to increase with this, in step with the increasing globalisation. So what then are the implications for the representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity? And what about the communities whose heritage that the Convention aims to protect? Will the heritage in fact be used to create false impressions of domestic harmony and respect for diversity? I think these are some of the questions that a lot of people working in intangible cultural heritage have to grapple with. In fact, cultural heritage, the convention, even though it is conceived as such a harmonising tool, international tool, one of the things that I found quite often when I was talking to people in Southeast Asia on a recent study tour is how often their questions reveal, if you like, a competitiveness that is generated by such conventions. One of the questions that most of them asked was, what are other people putting on their list? What's my neighbour putting up? So there's this idea of some sort of competition. So I'm going to have a few examples from my recent study tour because that actually just raised a few questions in my mind and started me thinking about these ideas. I don't have the answers to any of this, I have to say, so I'm not presenting any answers here. And I'll be very interested in seeing how these complexities can be approached through this idea of complexity science, of which I know very little about. So I think the three complexities that I will talk about a little bit are defining the community, how do we ensure consent, which is an important part of the convention, and how do we approach transborder ICH, which is really a variation of the first question, how do we define communities? So there's a large literature on the purpose and objectives of the 2003 Convention, and some of the most cited of these purposes include the protection of ICH and the influence of communities, because that's an implication. If you protect the ICH, you protect the communities. From the negative impacts of globalisation. Increased economic outcomes is often put up, and particularly through cultural tourism. Although also the actual resourcing of the inventorying process itself is a thing that brings economic input into relatively small communities sometimes. And also strengthening of local and national identities through the recognition of cultural heritage. I'm actually acknowledging here, so there are one of the trip that I did to Myanmar, Laos and Thailand, and I'm soon to go to Vietnam and Cambodia, is all part of a larger project which is being run by the Category 2 Centre in Japan. So I'd just like to acknowledge my fellow researchers there, and I'm not sure if any of you know Misako Anuki from that centre, and Professor Toshiyuko Kono. Okay, so the convention itself starts with a preamble, and in that preamble it recognises that the process of globalisation and social transformation alongside the conditions that create, sorry, one back, happy finger, whoa, two back. Okay, so this basically is in the preamble. I won't even read through it, it's up there for you to have a look at. But you can see that the preamble encapsulates there some of the drivers which the people who worked so hard to get this convention up had in the back of their mind. And they're all positive about diversity, about protecting communities and protecting things from the destruction, the perceived destruction of globalisation. So recognising, celebrating the diversity of human cultural expression is inarguably a positive thing to do. And of course, once that diversity is appreciated, then the obvious thing is to safeguard it, right? So indeed, most, if not all, the countries in Southeast Asia were already doing many of the things that work to encourage and safeguard elements of intangible cultural heritage before the 2003 Convention was created. They may not have used the term ICH, but they were doing many different things. They were running, there's the doyens of culture that runs in Myanmar. There's similar things in Laos and similar things in Thailand. There's a number of those countries that have university courses that are related to the arts and the continuation of ICH. So, to a large extent, everyone's focus is on the list. After all, it's the list that gains international recognition. And in our current field research, the one question we're commonly asked, as I said, was what are other countries listing? So this question reveals that competitiveness around a listing process, and we've seen it before in the World Heritage List with the older convention, and I guess it was one of the things that the people who put together this convention were trying to avoid. So the convention doesn't actually say you have to put the best thing up or it's the only thing up. It talks about representativeness, which is a very different concept to the concept of outstanding universal value in the World Heritage Convention. So, and perhaps some of the competitiveness is due to misconceptions because people are much more familiar with that earlier convention. Or perhaps it's just human nature that as soon as we start making a list, we want ours to be the best one. So the purpose of the convention, as you can see here, are not about listing. There's 4 purposes, and they're about safeguarding, ensuring respect, raising awareness, and providing for international cooperation and assistance. To achieve these purposes, though, one of the things that the convention does is establish 2 new lists. One is the representative list, which is what I'm going to be talking more about, and the other is the list of intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. And the purpose of this list is to ensure better visibility of the intangible cultural heritage and awareness of its significance, and to encourage dialogue which respects cultural diversity. So the list itself is really a tool to try and establish that awareness and the dialogue. The list itself is not supposed to be the end of the process. Okay. It also requires state parties to draw up inventories back home. and they have to establish an inventory and they have to report on it periodically to the committee. They have to adopt an ICH policy. They have to designate or establish an ICH institution, which I acknowledge goes to the complexity of these institutions we just heard about. Has to foster scientific, technical and artistic studies and research, and has to adopt appropriate legal, technical, administrative and financial measures. At first glance, it's difficult to see the complexity in the convention, but after all, it is a piece of international law that is focused on safeguarding diversity and fostering dialogue, which sounds simple. But however obvious it may seem to us, the protection and recognition of ICH involves to some degree protection and recognition of the communities that give rise to that ICH. And this is, of course, the first challenge, because the definition of communities is a fluid thing and can be looked at in many ways. International law, of course, is a system of law created by and for states, and as such is open to interpretation and implementation by them. In many cases, there are direct conflicts of intention and commitment between the politics and aspirations of the state and those of any given community. The reality is, of course, that some governments do not recognise some communities and may offer them no protection. This also raises questions of which elements of ICH are inventoried, and indeed which are brought forward and nominated by state parties for inscription. And if the state can favour nominations that reinforce the dominant cultural group at the expense of others, and although I haven't used the Chinese example there, from that talk this morning, I would put the state of China as one of the countries that does that quite overtly. This issue is pertinent to most nations, but it's particularly relevant to Southeast Asia, because this region contains some of the most ethnically diverse countries in the world. For example, in Myanmar today, ethnic minority groups are estimated to make up about 1/3 of Myanmar's population, of around 60 million people, and to inhabit half of the area of the land. There's been ongoing conflict between the state, which is made up of the dominant Burma people, of the lowlands, and the remaining ethnic groups. So at the end of the British colonisation of Burma in 1947, this was recognised even then, and it was intended that Burma become a federation of states. However, this didn't occur, and the distinction between the Burma, or Burma as Burma proper, and the highlands being the frontier regions is still reflected in the case today. So some commentators have labelled the conflict in Myanmar between the state and some of the ethnic groups as the world's longest ongoing civil war. Now recently, those of us who love Myanmar and have colleagues and friends there have seen that there's been recent steps towards an all-nation peace accord, and the government has changed. So who knows what's going to happen in the future? But what we do know, of course, is that the results of one election are not going to magically make all those deep historical divisions go away, and is not necessarily going to provide a solution straight away. There has been repeated suggestions that state parties sometimes use convention to promote a false view of their society and the political intolerance to minorities when they're presenting this to the outside world. So take the example of the Uyghur. In 2012, China successfully added the Uyghur Meshrep on UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. Very noble thing to do. However, many have noted that the imminent danger of extinction of the Uyghur traditions and the culture in today's China are a result of deliberate policies and actions of the state party, including the replacement of local traditional languages with Mandarin. Really though, indeed, one of the reasons that the Meshrep is actually endangered itself is that it has been banned by China since around 1997. So on the one hand, they ban it with severe intervention to the people who are practicing it, and on the other hand, they list it as an item that's under threat. This raises a number of questions about the convention and about how the list can be used. Okay. The problems that may exist between specific communities and state parties give rise to another area of complexity, and that's the area of consent, free, prior and informed consent. Article 15 of the Convention states, within the framework of its safeguarding activities of the intangible cultural heritage, each state party shall endeavour to ensure the widest possible participation of communities groups, and where appropriate, individuals that create, maintain and transmit such heritage and involve them actively in its management. The criteria, the actual article itself does not mention consent. It talks about consultation, and you can imagine the conversations that went behind the agreement to this wording. There are 5 criteria, though, for the assessment of nominations proposed for the representative list, and criterion R4 relates specifically to the issue of community consent. And the criterion states, the element has been nominated following the widest possible participation of the community, group, or if applicable, individuals concerned, and with their free, prior and informed consent. However, there's no specification of what form the consultation with communities must be and what evidence of consent must be provided to satisfy this criterion. And if you look at the list, which you can do, you can get into that list and you can look at the documents of consent. This is the Uyghur document of consent, signed by one person. Now, I don't really know enough about the Uyghur in China to know if that one person, whose name is very difficult to read anyway, is in fact the one person who is traditionally authorised to give free and informed consent. But I would suggest that if you look through that list and see the different methods that people have used for consent, some very clearly do try to get free and informed consent of the whole community, and a lot of other examples don't. In itself, that would be a very interesting research project. Okay, so some of the ICH elements have been added to the list with the consent of single individuals held to be the custodians of ICH, or in other cases, representatives of NGOs, such as NGOs that are responsible for puppetry or lacquerware or other things. And this presents serious, obvious problems within the state boundaries, but this whole consent business can be really multiplied if you look at the issue of transboundary nominations, of things that go across nation borders that occur in many countries. So the difficulty, of course, is that the question of who can give consent may vary depending on customary laws and traditional practices of certain minority groups or ethnic groups, and depending on the exclusivity or shared nature of the ICH being considered. It may be appropriate for consent to be given by a single person, a master craftsman, for instance, who is recognised as custodian of that art, while on the other hand, the whole community consent might be needed. So free, prior and informed consent should be supported with anthropological or legal evidence. However, for the most part, it seems that the committee accepts with relatively little scrutiny that the consent mechanism as provided by the state party is adequate. And frankly, this makes a mockery of the intentions of the Convention. And there's been a lot of research out there on free, prior and informed consent relating to Indigenous communities that could be brought to bear to aid the process and in terms of the Convention itself. The final complexity I'd like to mention is the issue of transborder nominations of ICH. This can be an issue anywhere, but it's certainly an added complexity in Southeast Asia where the borders have been fluid over time and ethnic diversity is a characteristic. So, for example, that's even just in one country, in Myanmar. These people exist in other places as well. One of the questions we were asked in Myanmar, one of the things brought to our attention in Myanmar by an individual, and not in this case a government official, was the worry about Chin fabrics, the Chin people's fabrics, their textiles, being listed by Thailand. Not that Thailand's listed yet, it's a perceived activity of inventorying and listing. And they said, but they're Chin people are Myanmar, they're Burmese. In Thailand, when you say this to Thai people, of course, they say, well, these people are Thai. They're Chin, but they're Thai residents and Thai citizens, and they've been here for 400 years or something. So this idea that pulling back the sort of culture that is quintessentially yours within your borders is not actually what the Convention is trying to do, but it is how people are interpreting it on the ground. Here's just an example of the Chinese and Indian people's diaspora across, across the world. So that shows you how trying to get community consent, depending on what you're talking about as the ICH, and depending on how you define the community, can become quite complex. There is nothing that in the Convention that explicitly excludes the same or similar elements being listed by multiple state parties, which might be a solution. So if you're going to do lacquerware in Asia, why isn't it Myanmar can't put up their lacquerware from Bagan, and Vietnam could put up their lacquerware, and Thailand could put up their lacquerware. However, and that's one way around it, because some governments are not going to talk to each other, let's face it, no matter how many conventions we put in place. However, the committee has a preference for such listings to be cooperative, and a state party nominating such an item in isolation is likely to be unsuccessful. Nevertheless, there are some really ambitious attempts at Transborder ICH, and for example, coming up later this year, I think, for consideration by the committee, is the proposal to list falconry, which involves a large number of state parties, including the United Arab Emirates, Austria, Belgium, Czech Republic, France, Hungary, Spain, Republic of Korea, Mongolia, Morocco, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Spain, and the Syrian Arab Republic. So you can imagine the work that goes into this complexity once you start doing these transborder nominations. And of course, that is one of the reasons why people try not to do the transborder nominations, because it's much simpler to get something out. So during our recent field trip, we conducted interviews with heritage officials, some NGOs and other researchers across the 3 countries, the Lao People's Republic, Thailand and Myanmar. Although not specifically the subject of our inquiries, one of the things that became obvious to us was this competitiveness that I'd mentioned before. And the knowledge that others were inventorying and, more importantly, contemplating nominating for inscription ICH that occurred in their countries and their neighbours was clearly inducing an element of stress. Lao, for instance, has recently nominated the can, and the can is an instrument that is also used in Thailand. So during our field trip, there was some acknowledgement by government officials and others that in fact the nomination of the can had been made without due consideration of the shared claim to this ICH from parts of Thailand. And some people we spoke to felt that the nomination, due for the consideration by the committee later this year, should be withdrawn pending more inclusive consultation. So why is there this race to inscription, in what is obviously complex areas sometimes? While some of the impetus to race to inscription is being considered may be attributed to politics and a feeling of nationalistic pride, undoubtedly it is really, or the need to compete in regional politics, as in any other field, and clearly that is a factor as well. It was obvious when we were doing our trip that the heritage officials are also feeling pressured by the perceived expectations of UNESCO to progress implementation. There's a need, as I mentioned before, to report annually on the progress of implementation. Now, I'm sure UNESCO people would be very distressed to think that people are making rash decisions based on something they think they're being told. But this was the perception that we observed. One of the exceptions to this seems to be Thailand. Despite being very active in ICH-related activities in the lead up to the convention, they have not yet ratified the convention. And this has brought them some valuable time, which they have used to develop on their own terms and establish the administrative framework to support the inventory and safeguarding activities required by the convention. There's been a lot of talk about what Thailand's legislation might be, and even in Thailand itself, some of the NGOs we spoke to were concerned because they'd heard rumours that it would be punitive and rumours that it would be this or that, the other thing. The Thai officials we spoke to had drafted the legislation, and it's due to be enacted any time, either this month or next month. Next month or the month after, February, March was what we were told. And we couldn't see a copy of the draft. However, they did describe the process, their journey, if you like, in writing the legislation, where they started with this, oh yes, you've got to protect and you've got to therefore have penalties and you've got to do other things, and move right back to something which is an enabling piece of legislation only. So it will be very interesting to see what that is. At the same time, the 300 plus elements that they have, at the same time, they have been busily inventorying themselves. And so at the same time as the legislation being introduced, their inventory will be created, and 300 plus elements of ICH will go onto their national list. And overall, this approach, just at least on the surface observations, appears to have avoided the pressure of having to be seen to be active before they had the key elements and resources relating to safeguarding in place. Neither of the other two countries, that's not true. Myanmar has no ICH legislation in place. They also have no intellectual property legislation in place, although there has been some of the latter drafted. They're a long way from having the ICH legislation. And Laos does have their National Heritage Act includes ICH. And there's been a recent amendment, but it was only available in Laos, so I've sent it to someone to translate for me. But in the case with Thailand, they seem to have anticipated the pressure once you actually sign up to the convention, and they have more or less got their house in order. It will be very interesting to see how that pans out, and it may be an interesting role model for Southeast Asia. So notwithstanding the methodical approach, we still found that they still had those concerns about, in the meantime, while we've been quietly doing this, what have our neighbours been doing? So that just seems to be something that's very, very hard to get away from, that idea of competition. So I have to confess, I'm not sure how complexity science can be applied to the field of ICH. However, it is a very complex field. And, I think once you start doing anything with communities and having to identify who the communities are and what they are and how they're defined, I think, you're automatically in complex waters. So I'd be very interested to see what contribution complexity science can make to this area of activity. I think even in the conversations we're having last night at drinks, it would be interesting to me to see how I could see there is a potential for it to really feed into some of the processes, if you like, improvement of the processes at the international listing sort of activity. So that's all I have to say, and I look forward to getting some great ideas from the rest of you.